May 15, 1942, Rechlin Airfield, Mecklenburg, Germany. The Flettner Fl 282 Kolibri sat on the tarmac at Rechlin like an insect constructed from steel and anxiety, its intermeshing rotors motionless in the morning air, while Oberleutnant Werner Klemm circled the machine for the third time that hour, his gloved hand tracing the fuselage where the Siemens Hauski SH-14A radial engine mounted behind the open cockpit, 7 cylinders arranged in a configuration that produced 140 horsepower and a sound like tearing canvas when engaged at full throttle. The Luftwaffe's chief test pilot for rotary wing development stood near the operations hut smoking a Juno cigarette, watching Klemm with the detached interest of a man who had seen 37 experimental aircraft fail in various spectacular fashions over the past 18 months. And the morning smelled of aviation fuel and cut grass and the particular metallic odor that clung to prototype machinery, while the wind came from the northeast at 8 knots, carrying the distant sound of Junkers Ju-88 bombers conducting pattern work over the Baltic approaches. Klemm had flown the Kolibri twice before, brief hops across the airfield that lasted no more than 4 minutes each, and both times the counter-rotating rotors had performed as Anton Flettner's engineers promised they would, the intermeshing blades passing each other with clearances measured in centimeters, the synchromesh gearing preventing the catastrophic blade strikes that had destroyed earlier prototypes at the Flettner facility in Bad Tolz. The aircraft weighed only 760 kilograms empty, its tubular steel frame covered in fabric doped tight as drumskin, and Klemm settled into the wicker seat that offered no protection from the slipstream or the cold or the inevitable mechanical failures that attended every test flight of every rotorcraft the Reich had attempted to field since the Fock-Achilles FA-61 first lifted off in 1936. He engaged the starter, and the SH-14A coughed twice before catching, the propeller spinning behind his head while the rotor blades began their slow acceleration, the intermeshing system producing a rhythmic whop-whop-whop that increased in frequency until the individual beats merged into a sustained roar, and the entire airframe began to shake with the peculiar vibration that characterized all helicopters, a trembling that seemed to originate in the machine's bones and transmitted directly into the pilot's skeleton through the seat and the rudder kettles and the cyclic control stick that jutted up between his knees. At 07:15 hours, Klemm pulled collective pitch and the Kolibri lifted vertically from the concrete, rising at 2 meters per second while the intermeshing rotors carved their circles overhead and the radio engine screamed at 1900 revolutions per minute, the airframe yawing slightly to starboard before Klemm corrected with rudder pressure and the machine steadied at 50 meters altitude, hovering in ground effect while the operations officer watched through binoculars and made notations on a clipboard that flapped in the rotor wash. The test profile called for a circuit of the airfield perimeter at low altitude, followed by a simulated reconnaissance run over the adjacent terrain, and Klemm nosed the Kolibri forward by pushing the cyclic stick, the aircraft translating from hover to forward flight at 40 kilometers per hour, then 60, the fabric skin drumming in the slipstream while the rotor system maintained its precarious balance and the engine temperature gauge climbed into the yellow arc as the cooling airflow decreased in the hover and low-speed regime. The landscape unrolled beneath the open cockpit with the clarity that only low-altitude flight provided, every fence post and drainage ditch visible in the spring sunlight. And Klemm understood in that moment what the Kriegsmarine officers had understood when they first witnessed the Kolibri operating from the deck of the cruiser Köln during trials the previous autumn, that this machine offered capabilities no fixed-wing aircraft could match, the ability to observe from a stationary position, to land on a ship's deck in any wind, to operate from clearings and roads and any patch of level ground large enough to accommodate the rotor diameter of 11.96 meters. He completed the circuit at 75 meters altitude, noting the control responses and the fuel consumption and the engine parameters, then set up for a landing approach back to the starting position, reducing collective pitch while maintaining forward speed until the Kolibri entered ground effect again and the rotor system found purchase in its own downwash, the aircraft settling onto the tarmac with a firmness that compressed the landing gear struts and brought a thin smile to Klemm's face as he reduced throttle and the rotors coasted down down through their operational envelope toward stillness. The chief test pilot approached as soon as the blade stopped turning, flicking his cigarette into the grass and pulling a folder from under his arm, and Clem knew before the man spoke that production authorization had been granted, that somewhere in Berlin the bureaucrats and engineers had calculated that 24 Kolibri helicopters could be manufactured for naval reconnaissance duties, and the Bayerische Motorenwerke facility in Munich would receive the contract. That within 6 months the first operational machines would deploy to Kriegsmarine vessels in the Baltic and the Mediterranean, where their unique capabilities would be tested not against the benign conditions of a Mecklenburg morning, but against the fire and chaos that attended naval warfare in the third year of a conflict that consumed men and machines with equal appetite. And as Clem unbuckled his harness and climbed from the wicker seat, he felt the weight of that knowledge settle onto his shoulders like snow accumulating on a roof that might or might not support the load through winter. While overhead the clouds moved eastward toward the front lines where the Wehrmacht advanced toward Stalingrad, and the future hung suspended between triumph and catastrophe, with the same precarious balance as the intermeshing rotors of the Flettner Fl 282 Kolibri.
October 8, 1943. Aegean Sea, 40 nautical miles southeast of Rhodes. The Kolibri trembled on the stern deck of the torpedo boat TA-10 while Lieutenant Zusi Hans Bartels performed his pre-flight inspection in the Mediterranean dawn. The intermeshing rotors folded back along the fuselage where they had been secured for the night transit from Piraeus, and the sea state ran at 1 meter with a following wind from the northwest that pushed whitecaps across water the color of hammered pewter. TA-10 belonged to the 9th Torpedo Boat Flotilla, a former Italian destroyer reclassified after Italy's surrender the previous month, and now she steamed on patrol searching for Allied vessels attempting the supply run to resistance forces operating in the Dodecanese. Her captain, a veteran of Baltic convoy operations, who had requisitioned the FL-282 from naval aviation stores in Athens after reading an intelligence summary that mentioned the helicopter's successful deployment aboard the cruiser Drache during Baltic reconnaissance missions. Bartels had accumulated 19 hours in the Kolibri across 7 weeks of operations, enough time to understand the machine's temperament and limitations, the way the Siemens Hauski engine ran hot in Mediterranean conditions, the manner in which crosswinds above 15 knots made deck launches hazardous, and the fact that fuel consumption at cruise speed gave him exactly 47 minutes of flight time before reserves dropped to the point where continuation meant risking a water landing that would certainly destroy the aircraft and probably kill the pilot. The deck crew removed the rotor locks at 0620 hours while TA-10 turned into the wind and reduced speed to 8 knots, the torpedo boat's wake straightening as she steadied on course 270 degrees, and Bartels climbed into the exposed cockpit wearing a Kriegsmarine flight suit and a Kapok life vest that would provide perhaps 10 minutes of buoyancy in the event of ditching, though the sea temperature of 18 degrees Celsius meant hypothermia would claim him before rescue arrived, unless TA-10 remained within visual range. He engaged the starter, and the radial engine fired immediately, the intermeshing rotors beginning their rotation while exhaust smoke whipped aft across the deck, and the torpedo boat's bridge personnel watched through the observation ports, their faces green-tinted in the reflected glow of the compass repeater and the engine telegraphs. At 0628 hours, Bartels pulled collective, and the Kolibri lifted clear of the deck, climbing vertically to avoid the torpedo boat's superstructure before transitioning to forward flight and turning onto a southeasterly heading that would take him along the patrol line where intelligence suggested a British motor launch might attempt passage toward Castellorizo under cover of the dawn light. The altitude stabilized at 120 meters and the airspeed indicated 75 kilometers per hour. The engine temperature within limits despite the ambient air already warming as the sun climbed above the horizon and turned the sea surface into a mirror that threw glare into Bartels' eyes despite the tinted goggles he wore. The Aegean stretched in all directions, empty of vessels, except for TA-10's gray silhouette receding astern, and Bartels began a standard search pattern, flying legs of 2 kilometers before turning 90 degrees and flying the perpendicular,
building a grid that covered the suspected transit route while he scanned the surface for the telltale wake signature or the white bow wave that would betray a vessel attempting to blend with the morning haze. At 0643 hours, he spotted the motor launch, a British Fairmile B-class running at 20 knots on course 310 degrees, her deck gun manned and her ensign clearly visible even from Bartel's altitude, and he keyed the radio transmitter to relay the contact report to TA-10 before beginning a wide orbit that kept the Kolibri outside the effective range of the launch's 20mm Oerlikon cannon. The motor launch altered course immediately, turning hard to starboard and increasing speed, her commander clearly aware that the helicopter's presence meant a surface engagement would follow within minutes, and Bartels maintained his orbit while watching TA-10's smoke appear on the northwestern horizon, the torpedo boat driving at 30 knots with her bow wave climbing and her exhaust laying a dark streak across the morning sky. The engagement developed with the mechanical inevitability of a clockwork mechanism running down, TA-10 closing the range, while the Fairmile attempted to maneuver toward the coastal shallows, where the torpedo boat's deeper draft would limit pursuit options. And at 0657 hours, the first rounds from TA-10's 10.5-centimeter deck gun splashed 50 meters short of the British vessel, the detonation sending up columns of white water that hung suspended for 3 seconds before collapsing back into the sea. Bartels climbed to 200 meters to clear the engagement zone, circling overhead while TA-10 walked her fire closer to the target. The third salvo straddled the motor launch, and the fourth striking her amidships with a flash that seemed almost gentle until the explosion sound reached Bartels 2 seconds later, a dull crump that carried clearly through the engine noise and the rotor wash. The motor launch began losing way immediately, smoke pouring from her engine compartment while her crew abandoned ship, small figures in life vests jumping from the rails into water that would be warm enough to sustain them until TA-10 closed to pick up survivors. And Bartels recorded the time and position in his knee pad log while the engagement concluded below with the precision of a training exercise, the torpedo boat circling the sinking launch while her boats deployed to collect the British sailors who floated in clusters among the debris field. At 0719 hours, Bartels received the recall signal and turned back toward TA-10, which had resumed her patrol course and now steamed at 15 knots with the rescued British crew confined below decks and the engagement already becoming paperwork that would be filed in Piraeus and forwarded to naval headquarters in Berlin, where staff officers would note that the FL-282 Kolibri had once again proven its worth as a reconnaissance asset, extending the visual range of surface vessels beyond the limitations of mast-mounted observers and providing the early detection that made successful interceptions possible. Bartels set up his approach carefully, judging the torpedo boat's motion and the wind direction, bringing the Kolibri into a hover alongside the deck before transitioning sideways and settling onto the landing pad with the light touch that came from daily practice. And as the deck crew rushed forward to secure the aircraft and fold the rotors, he sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds longer than necessary, letting the engine cool and the rotor system spin down, while he thought about the British sailors now imprisoned below decks, men who had been attempting to sustain resistance fighters and who had instead become casualties of a war that grew more complex with each passing month. And the sunlight streaming through the open cockpit felt too warm and too bright for the work he had just completed. But the work continued regardless, because that was the nature of naval warfare in the Mediterranean in the autumn of 1943. An endless sequence of patrols and contacts and engagements that blurred together until individual actions lost meaning and became simply data points in the larger calculus of attrition and survival.
March 17, 1945, Peenemünde Army Research Center, Usedom Island, Germany. The Kolibri, designated V7+FH, sat in the corner of Hangar Dry, with fabric skin weathered to the color of old bone, and the intermeshing-rotor system missing 14 centimeters of blade tip, where flak fragments had sheared through the laminated wood during the final extraction flight from Danzig 6 days earlier. And Oberfähnrich Kurt Steinfeld stood beside the machine,
filling out the decommissioning paperwork, while outside the hangar, Soviet artillery fired ranging shots that impacted in the pine forest 2 kilometers to the south, the concussions arriving as muffled thumps that caused the corrugated metal walls to vibrate in sympathy. The research center that had once employed 4,000 scientists and engineers now functioned with a skeleton crew of 200 personnel, tasked with destroying sensitive equipment and evacuating westward whatever documentation could be transported before the Red Army's advance made further operations impossible. And Steinfeld had been assigned to flight operations because he possessed 41 hours in the FL-282, more than any other pilot still present at Peenemünde after the systematic evacuation that had begun when Soviet forces crossed the Oder River in late January. The Kolibri had arrived at the facility in October 1943 as one of the operational test aircraft assigned to maritime reconnaissance duties. But the collapse of the Eastern Front had redirected it to liaison and emergency courier work, missions that required landing in forest clearings and bomb-damaged airfields where fixed-wing aircraft could not operate. And V-7 plus FH had completed 63 such missions before the Danzig flight that ended with Soviet anti-aircraft fire over the Vistula Delta, 12.7mm rounds from a DSHK heavy machine gun that had punched holes through the fabric covering and reduced the Siemens Halske engine to a smoking wreck that nonetheless continued running long enough for Steinfeld to reach friendly territory and execute a controlled crash landing in a turnip field outside Dinya. At 13:15 hours, a Hauptmann from the Evacuation Coordination Office entered the hangar carrying a dispatch case and informed Steinfeld that Naval Headquarters in Flensburg required one final mission: an evacuation flight carrying classified documents 280 kilometers westward, a journey that would push the Kolibri to the absolute limit of its range, even with favorable winds and optimal fuel consumption. Steinfeld walked around V-7 plus FH, examining the damage, running his hand along the fuselage where shrapnel had punched through the steel frame, and considering whether the Siemens Halske engine could be coaxed into producing full power for the 3 hours such a flight would require. And the artillery fire from the south intensified as he worked through the calculations, Soviet guns firing for effect now rather than ranging shots, the explosions walking closer through the pine forest in a sequence that suggested the bombardment was preparatory to a ground assault. At 14:40 hours, Steinfeld gave his assessment, explaining that with a replacement engine from the maintenance depot and 12 hours of work by the remaining ground crew, V-7 plus FH might achieve operational status, though the damage to the rotor system and the degraded condition of the fabric covering meant the flight would carry significant risk, particularly if weather conditions deteriorated or if the aircraft encountered anti-aircraft fire during the transit across the Soviet advance lines. The Hauptmann stated that the mission was authorized and that Steinfeld should begin preparations immediately, that the classified documents would arrive by 1800 hours, and the departure was scheduled for first light the following morning, assuming the facility remained under German control through the night. The ground crew appeared from their positions in the revetments and began work on V-7 plus FH with the exhausted efficiency of men who had performed similar miracles daily for the past 4 years, removing the damaged engine and installing a replacement unit cannibalized from a Kolibri that had crashed during a training flight in November, patching the fabric skin with doped linen, balancing the rotor system by trial and error because the proper test equipment had been evacuated to Schleswig 3 weeks earlier. At 22:30 hours, the engine installation was complete, and Steinfeld performed a ground run, bringing the Siemens Halske up to full power while the intermeshing rotors turned overhead and the entire hangar filled with exhaust smoke and the deafening roar of a radial engine operating at maximum continuous power. And after 5 minutes, he shut down, satisfied that the power plant would hold together long enough to complete the mission, though the oil pressure ran slightly low and the cylinder head temperatures climbed into the red arc faster than specification allowed. The classified documents arrived at 01:15 hours in a steel case weighing 18 kilograms, accompanied by a Korvettenkapitän, who provided sealed orders and a manifest that Steinfeld signed without reading. And the remaining hours before dawn passed in a suspended state between preparation and exhaustion, Steinfeld trying to rest in the operations office, while artillery fire continued intermittently and the sound of small arms fire echoed from the direction of Karlshagen, where the last defensive positions guarded the southern approaches. At 0540 hours on March 18th, he walked to Hangar Dry through darkness complete except for the orange glow on the southern horizon where something large burned uncontrolled. And the ground crew had already positioned V7 plus FH outside on the concrete apron, the intermeshing rotors unfolded and the steel document case secured in the observer's position behind the pilot's seat. Steinfeld performed his pre-flight inspection by flashlight, checking control surfaces and fuel quantity and oil levels, then climbed into the wicker seat and engaged the starter, the Siemens Halske coughing twice before catching, the familiar vibration building through the airframe as the rotor system accelerated toward operational speed. At 0603 hours, he pulled collective and the Kolibri lifted clear of the concrete, climbing vertically through the darkness while Peenemünde fell away below, the facility's scattered lights disappearing as he turned westward and transitioned to cruise flight, the airspeed building to 80 kilometers per hour while the altimeter indicated 300 meters and the engine temperature gauge climbed steadily toward the yellow arc. And ahead lay 280 kilometers of contested airspace and uncertain weather and the slim possibility that both the machine and the pilot would survive to deliver their cargo to whatever remained of the Kriegsmarine's administrative apparatus in Schleswig-Holstein. And as the dawn light began to gray the eastern sky behind him, Steinfeld thought about all the Kolibri helicopters that had lifted from decks and airfields across Europe during the past 3 years, the reconnaissance flights over the Baltic and the courier missions across the Eastern Front, and the liaison duties that had carried urgent dispatches and wounded personnel. And he understood that V7 plus FH's final flight represented not a meaningful contribution to Germany's defense, but rather a gesture of completion, a closing of the circle that had begun at Rechlin in the spring of 1942, when the Flettner Fl-282 Kolibri at first demonstrated that helicopters could operate in military roles. And now, as the Reich entered its final days, one last Kolibri flew westward, carrying documents that might or might not matter to anyone who remained alive to read them, the intermeshing rotors turning overhead in the dawn light, while below the landscape transformed from darkness to gray to the pale gold of early morning, and Steinfeld held his heading and monitored his instruments and flew the machine with the precision that had kept him alive through 4 years of war, knowing that precision was all any pilot could offer when history rendered everything else meaningless.